A great big pre-Victoria Day long weekend welcome to my great cohort of Herle Burlyites. I'll be big green egging it this weekend here at the Herle Burly worldwide headquarters deep in the heart of Quebec's gently rolling Gatineau Hills. We've got a two-part pod today. Part one is award-winning national health writer Andre Picard. Absolutely thrilled that he agreed to come on the podcast. He's one of Canada's top health and public policy observers and commentators. He's been writing for the Globe and Mail since 1987 and is an 8-time nominee for the National Newspaper Awards and the author of 5 best-selling books. His latest is an important one, Neglected No More, the urgent need to improve the lives of Canada's elders in the wake of a pandemic. We'll be taking a deep dive into that exceptional book and what needs to be done to improve the state of care for our elders. I also want to take a moment to tease next week's show. Prepare yourselves for a right honorable treat. Our guest is former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, architect of the largest majority in Canadian electoral history. As you'd expect, I gave Mr. Mulroney the option to come on the pod. I told him, "You have an option, sir. You could have said, no, I'm not going to do it." But graciously, he's coming on here anyway, and we're chuffed about it. Don't miss it, Herle Burlyites. Part 2 this week, as it is every week, is our political panel with Jenni, Byrne, and Scott Reid. We're going to talk about Jason Kenney and his Caucus unrest in Alberta, the continuing saga of Doug Ford and the opening of Ontario, and the feds are rolling out their vaccine comms, but it sounds like a bad Netflix show to me. 1-dose summer, 2-dose fall, starring Jason Bateman and Drew Barrymore. We'll pull it apart and weigh in on whether comms like that helps, hinders, or just kind of sits there on the sidelines, ignored, like so many AstraZeneca vaccines. Andre Picard, great to have you on the show. Where are you and how are you?
I'm not too bad. I'm COVID good, and I'm in beautiful Vancouver.
Really? Vancouver? What's the weather like in Vancouver right now?
Oh, it's a beautiful sunny morning with looking over at the ocean and the mountains, so you can't beat that.
You literally can't beat that. Vancouver on a sunny day is the most beautiful place in Canada. Spectacular. Yeah, I love it. Your book. I want to get into it in a lot of detail, but I'd like to start off with some general discussions about the country and COVID before we get into the elder care and LTC aspects of it specifically. You've been covering this thing from pillar to post. I've been following everything you write and say on Twitter voraciously. What has surprised you about the way Canada has handled this pandemic, one way or another? What has been unusual to you from what you might have expected?
I think maybe not totally unexpected, but disappointing would be how we've learned so little. You know, we seem to have learned little from SARS. There was big lessons in SARS 15, 16 years ago now. We didn't heed those, so we had trouble. And then the refusal to learn from one wave to the other, what could prevent things from getting worse. So we just keep repeating the same mistakes. So that's a frustration for someone who's an avid watcher of COVID, like I am.
All right. You said in the book that, and you were talking, I think this is early in the book, and you were, I believe, talking more broadly than long-term care. And you said that the pandemic had revealed structural flaws in our governance and in the organization of our society. What were you referring to?
I think COVID has really shone a spotlight on all the kind of the weak points in society. So, you know, the way we treat people who are, you know, essential workers, but not treated as essential, you know, underpaid, taken for granted, etc. The book I wrote about a very neglected group, elders, you know, just kind of forgotten, shunted off to the side of society. Healthcare workers, to a certain degree, we've come to appreciate them more. So all these things in our lives that we take for granted, that we don't really support with infrastructure, with programs, etc. And that's who's been harmed the most by the pandemic. So when something like this, when a crisis comes along, it goes for the weak points. And this is more than anything else, the pandemic has revealed these weak points in society.
That's not going to change, though, is it, our approach to essential workers? We've already seen that because we had the big exposure and the big awakening about essential workers in the spring of 2020, and we haven't done anything about it since. We made it worse, if anything. Took away their pandemic pay at the first available opportunity.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't seem to learn lessons very well. We have very short memories. So there's some little inklings of hope, the way Quebec did a mass recruitment of long-term care workers, for example, doubled their wages. Those are little signals that things are, many provinces adopting paid sick leave, something that was long overdue. So there's little advancements, but no large, big policy changes, unfortunately.
Yeah, it feels like a year ago we were kind of re-examining things about our society, but that moment appears to have passed. Do you get that sense?
Yeah, unfortunately, I do get a bit of that sense that we want to move on. All we keep hearing these days is let's get back to normal, let's get back to normal. And we've kind of forgotten that early lesson early in the pandemic when we were really worried when we saw that the gravity of it, that we said, no, maybe we should do things differently. Society should be a better place. We should just shouldn't go back to what we did before, which put us in this pickle in the first place. But you're right, we seem to have forgotten a lot of this, unfortunately.
Right. I know that you're not looking for scapegoats right now, and you're not that interested in casting blame, but I've got you on the show. So, what do you think are the worst decisions that we made during the pandemic? From the time that governments would have been aware that something was happening in Wuhan, what are the worst mistakes we made?
I'll preface it by saying, as you hinted, I think there's a lot of blame to go around. I don't think anybody was perfect in this. The media wasn't perfect either. So I would be careful not to be throwing too many darts because some may come back and wound me. But I think a lot of us learned a lot from our mistakes, hopefully. But I think the big one is just not learning the early lesson of the pandemic, which is that you have to act really swiftly and decisively. It's better. I wrote early in the pandemic very often, it's better to be quick and wrong than to be slow and wrong. And I think in Canada, unfortunately, we were often very slow and wrong. So it's, nobody knew the magical answers to this early on. Things like masking, our policies changed, but I'm very reluctant to go back and say, hindsight's always 2020. So I'm reluctant to go back and say, we should have known in March 2020 that we all should wear masks. That's not what the research said at the time. And we now know that the research was terrible. So we learned that lesson. I think we're better on masking, for example. Borders, I think borders is an issue we learned a lot about in Canada. Again, the research suggested that closing international borders had a lot of collateral damage that would make things worse. I think in retrospect, that's probably wrong as well. We've learned to control borders a little better. So there's a lot of things like that. There's a whole long list where we wish we had done it differently, but I'm not sure that if we had the same information at the same time that we would do a lot of things differently. I think the only one is the acting more decisively part is the one I always focus on.
Okay, you did mention borders, though. Does that mean that you think that the Ford government has a point with its campaign about borders right now?
Well, there's no question that the government has a point about we have to control borders better, but it's not as easy as we make it out to be. We want our food on the table, etc. We have to have truckers come in. We have to have some movement between countries. We're two of the biggest trading partners in the world. So it's not so simple to say let's seal the border. Very few countries in the world actually do that. I think North Korea is the one that has the most sealed border in the world, and it's not exactly someone to copy and emulate. So I think we have to, again, we always try and find this balance, right? That's the Canadian thing. Let's close something, but not quite close it. And often we didn't find the balance too much in that. But, in all these debates, it's all Ford's fault, it's all Trudeau's fault. None of those things are true. They all have good policies, they have bad policies, and we have to, I think, be careful to not blame everything on one level of government. Again, I get tired of repeating this, but there's lots of blame to go around.
Right. Did we have the wrong objective initially? I don't hear a lot of talk about this, but one of the things I remember is that back in the spring when this thing first hit us, our national objective, as I understood it, was to flatten the curve of growth of the virus, to flatten the curve of the spread of the virus so that we didn't overwhelm our healthcare system. I don't recall any talk of zero COVID or of stamping the virus out. It was more a fact of controlling it. In retrospect, was that wrong?
Well, I think in retrospect, maybe it was wrong, but not many countries in the world that were talking about zero COVID at the time. That's not how pandemics worked in the past. It was always sort of, we're going to have to learn to live with them. The idea of having a vaccine, in 2-3 years, that was a dream back then. Nobody would have imagined we've had a vaccine in less than a year. So I think, again, that flattening the curve approach was one that most of the world followed. And Canada, went along. It did something similar. I think what we did wrong was not pursuing flattening of the curve, but sort of giving up on the flattening a little too soon each time. So we did that in each wave. Each time we got a little bit ahead of the game. Oh, let's reopen. And we reopened too quickly. So to me, that was the big mistake. I'm not sure if COVID zero was ever a realistic possibility in a country the size of Canada, with our international travel attached to the US, et cetera. We saw it work fairly well in zones like the Atlantic provinces. But I don't know if it would work in something the size of Ontario. I guess we'll never know. But in retrospect, it would have been a great idea to try that, but I'm not sure it would have worked.
Right. I just want to close off with one question on the overall thing before we get into elder care. Is there any evidence that you have seen that Canada, the federal government, could have procured more vaccines earlier than it did?
Oh, I think there's no question that anything is possible. We saw that based on what other countries have done. We saw that Israel got vaccines much quicker. Many countries got vaccine quicker than Canada. I think the mistake in our procurement was not the best contract negotiation. So I think we, again, in retrospect, I think we're brilliant signing lots of contracts. I don't think anyone knew that was a good idea. It's probably dumb luck. I think the problem with those contracts is that they were too backloaded. So I think we should have been a little more tough negotiators and negotiated faster deliveries. We should have negotiated deliveries by week rather than by quarter. So, when we said, we're going to get X million doses in March, it's a big difference between March 1st and March 31st. So if we had done it by week. So these are little technical points about contract negotiation, about procurement that, again, are easy for me to criticize in retrospect, but I wasn't in those rooms. We know that countries that paid more got their vaccines quicker. We know that countries with domestic production got more vaccines. This is all sensible in the business world. So I think there are lessons for the future. But again, I'm not sure we could have done dramatically better. Now where we're sitting with vaccination, we're sitting pretty right now. We're doing quite well. Again, a couple of months ago, it looked like a catastrophe.
I've got 2-dose envy, Andre. I've got 2-dose envy.
Yeah, well, so, lots of us, I only have 1 dose too, but I think compared to a lot of the world, we're doing well. I was just reading an editorial in my paper this morning in the Globe saying, we're putting the Americans to shame now with the way we're rolling out, and they're sputtering. So all these things go, they change with the passage of time. And I've said all along, I said that I thought Canada's rollout was going to be bumpy. I said that back in February, I wrote that by June, we're going to be swimming in vaccine. And I think that's proving to be true. So all these things, we have to have a longer term outlook to look a bit at the marathon finish rather than all these little individual sprints along the way where we've stumbled a few times.
Right. Okay. Let's move to long-term care. I'm not a complete stranger to this. Like most Canadians, I know people I've had people close to me in long-term care. But I had Charlene Stewart, the head of SEIU Healthcare, on the show a couple of years ago, well before COVID, talking about the shame that were our long-term care homes pre-COVID. They were a disgrace. And I've got polling to show that almost everybody in Canada knew that, Andre, that they were a disgrace. They might not have known the exact details, and you could shock people with stories about full diapers or shock people with stories about food, but people knew that they were places you did not want to be if you could avoid it. Why didn't we care about that?
Well, first of all, you're right. We've known this. I've been writing about this for 30 years. There was nothing new in the conditions. They've just sort of been getting gradually worse. The big question you're asking, well, why? I think it comes down to one word. It comes down to ageism. Older people are disposable members of society. They just didn't really matter. So we warehouse them off, out of sight, out of mind. A lot of these homes are off by the highway, out of mainstream society, and they're just forgotten. We kind of have this nihilistic view that, when you get old, you get sick and you die. And that's that. We're all headed there. So I think a lot of it is just public attitude. It's baked in ageism in our policies. And it's just, there always seems to be another priority. We've done countless reports. I talk in my book, there's been 150 reports written about this sector and how to fix it. Every time one's published, there's a little article in the media, we get outraged for 24 hours or less. And then we move on and we say, that's terrible, but there's other things to do. We've got to, deal with free trade or childcare or whatever the other issue of the day is. So it just always is sort of down the list of things to fix, unfortunately.
We don't really seem to value care very much in our society, do we? We prefer it to be either free or as cheap as possible.
I don't think we value people enough is what it comes down to, and we value them less as they get older. So I think we all value having sickness care when we need it, but we don't like to think about that. So that's another part of the problem, is nobody ever wants to think about, I'm going to get old and rickety someday. So we push that aside. And when you have that attitude, I'm not going to think about it, we don't create policies, and it's easy to ignore that. So again, some of it comes back to the individual. It comes back to our culture. There's a real mess of things that come into making this sector the disaster that it is.
You Herle Burlyites know how hard we work to bring you our show without technical glitches. But since the pandemic started, I've been podcasting from my cottage, deep in rural Quebec, where my satellite signal is always, sketchy would be the polite adjective. Check me out on YouTube. I'm Jittery Herle. I'd like to blame the coffee, but it's my internet. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, has made it their mission to connect as many Canadians as possible, including remote communities and Indigenous peoples, to the critical services they need. For example, Bonne-Espérance, in Quebec's lower North Shore, is now home to 2 brand new side-by-each cell towers, built by TELUS on the highest hill in the region. Nice, but what real impact do they have? Normand Bellefleur is the director of Unaman Shipu Band Council. He's an experienced boatsman. On a particularly cold November evening, as he was navigating the waters of the Gulf of St. Lawrence in utter darkness, his boat hit a shoal at low tide. He was thrust into the icy water. There was the painful shock of the cold. Normand found his physical and mental strength quickly depleting. In prior years, that would have ended in tragedy. Not this time. His crew member's cell phone and newfound flawless connectivity brought them hope, and more importantly, the emergency help they needed. High-speed internet across the whole region has also meant significant economic growth. People don't have to leave home anymore to follow their professional dreams. And now, with the arrival of 5G in Canada, TELUS is continuing to work with federal, provincial, and Indigenous governments to bring 5G to even more urban, rural, and remote communities, so their signals travel further and faster, covering more of this vast land, including, theoretically, me, your favorite podcaster, living right here in Denholm, Quebec. Just head north on Highway 307 from Ottawa. I'll leave a light on for you. Find out more at telus.com/5G. When I was reading your book, I found myself thinking about, and my mother lived to be 94, and she stayed at home that whole time, and that required an enormous amount of care from several members of my family who were living in the same city that she was, plus home care and all the things you talk about in the book. But as I was reading your book, it got me thinking about what are the relative responsibilities of the family and of the state when it comes to elder care.
I don't think there's an exact formula.
Surely family plays a role.
Yeah, there's no exact formula, state versus family. But I think there's no question that families, we expect a lot of them, and we should. There's no question either. To me, I've met, countless caregivers over the years, and I think there's no doubt that the vast majority provide care lovingly and willingly. It's amazing what some people do. If you look at the statistics, about 7.8 million caregivers in Canada, and about 10% of those, so 780,000 of them, dedicate more than 40 hours a week to this. So this is essentially a full-time job, most of them women, most of them working. So this is a full-time job on top of your full-time job of caring for a loved one, 40, 50, 60 hours a week. And people do that, and very few of them complain, but I think what we have to do is give them more support, just a little bit of respite care, give people a break sometimes, give them better access to services when they need them. So to me, it's about giving people, just not driving them into the ground. That's what we do. We literally work people to death before they have access to services. So we have to get that balance right. I think there's no question that the family has a lot of responsibility. Just as we care for our children, we don't depend entirely on the state, but we depend on it a bit. And it's the same with our elders. And I think that's true of countries around the world. Even the ones with the best elder care make a lot of demands on family, but they're also clear about it. Here are the expectations, and here's what we'll do to help. And we don't do that in Canada. We don't provide that help.
Yeah. And respite care, my God, because you were telling personal stories in the book, and one of the things it brings clear is that when somebody gets sick, when an elderly person gets sick, gets the early signs of dementia or anything like that, somebody else's life ends at that moment too. They're a caregiver. They may have had dreams of travel. They may have had dreams of doing all kinds of things in their retirement, but now they know what their retirement is. Their retirement is taking care of their spouse.
Yeah, there's no question it has a huge impact on people. And again, it's almost always women, and they have other, they're often caring for children. They have jobs, plus then they have the loved one with dementia. And it is very, very demanding. It affects, so then what do? Well, they take time off work. It affects their pension, affects their income, affects their career path. So there's all kinds of consequences of this caring that are harmful, and not all of them are avoidable, but some of them are. So we have to, I think it's about getting that balance a little better, and just giving people a hand up occasionally.
Okay. How is it possible? You will have spent a lot of time examining how governments have made decisions. How is it possible that when people were sitting around having the very first discussions around a cabinet table about how to handle the pandemic, that people didn't say, because you wouldn't have had to be an expert, it's just as a layperson to say, aren't long-term care homes going to be super vulnerable to this virus? How could that not have been at the top of your list of things you needed to protect? And it appears to have been absolutely and utterly forgotten. I don't understand how that's even possibly true.
Yeah, it is hard to imagine. We had so many warning signs that this was coming. Canada had that advantage. We saw the devastation in, people remember in Italy and Spain, what was happening before COVID came to Canada. And it was almost entirely older people. They were dying in their homes. They were dying in hospitals, etc. So why didn't we do something? I think, again, it comes back to, our culture. It comes to the structure of our system. We have our healthcare, or I always call it a sickness care system in Canada, is built around hospitals. So everything was about protecting hospitals. During SARS, we had 44 deaths in Canada. They were all in hospitals. It was we thought that this was another SARS, that hospitals were vulnerable, and we actually did a tremendous job in Canada. Our hospitals have been remarkable. There have been very few deaths, very few outbreaks. We really put the iron ring around hospitals, but then we just kind of forget the rest of the system. Long-term care has the big disadvantage of not really being a system. It's just a whole bunch of homes owned by a bunch of people. There's no organization to it whatsoever. Nobody really is in charge of it. There's a junior minister, long-term care minister, but that's so secondary to the health minister. So I think it's just one of those things where it was priority number 32 when it should have been priority number 1 or 2. So I don't think there was any malice shocking in this. I just think it's this systemic neglect that exists.
You used a term that Ford uses, iron ring. I don't know what that means. What did Ford mean it to mean? What did Ford do to create an iron ring around long-term care? I don't know what an iron ring is, but...
Yeah, I think I know what the idea means, but he certainly didn't do it. So the idea was we're going to create this moat around these homes to make sure that the virus doesn't get in. So nothing of that sort was done. We did do that in hospitals. What did it mean? It means providing personal protective equipment to workers, testing them. As soon as there's a case, you isolate that person. So all these standard infection control measures, they were done exceptionally well in our hospitals, the way they weren't done during SARS. But we just didn't carry that over to long-term care homes. They literally didn't have personal protective equipment. We know from the Long-Term Care Commission that between March 22nd and April 22nd, there were literally thousands and thousands of deaths in Ontario homes. The workers didn't have personal protective equipment. They were moving between homes. They were often working in several facilities, carrying the virus with them. People were still living 3-4 to a room. We weren't isolating once people were infected. We weren't isolating them, so they were infecting others. When people were sick, we weren't shipping them to hospitals. We had policies saying, well, essentially, they're old and they're going to die, so just leave them there. Personnel stopped showing up. Not surprising. They have terrible pay, no protection. So there's a whole series of factors that just meet.
Yeah, you're not going to risk your life for $15 an hour.
No, absolutely not. Why would you? And it's hard to. I don't blame the workers for fleeing. They were put in an untenable situation.
Right. So all the anger that existed last spring about long-term care, I was really optimistic last spring that this had been such an awful thing that people couldn't ignore it and that change would come to the sector. All that anger seems to have dissipated, and I would have been surprised to see provincial budgets roll by and nobody has any long-term plans to do anything about elder care or long-term care. Afterthought in the federal budget that had scads of money for everybody, had a little dribble for long-term care and no real thought about how that would be spent or what would happen with it. What's going on?
Well, we're just falling back on our old ways of, they're old people, they're going to die, let's forget about them, unfortunately. Like you, I've been...
They're old people in the aggregate, Andre, but individually, there are parents.
Yeah, absolutely.
And us, eventually.
Yeah, we're all going there. But why the policy neglect? I think that's difficult to understand. I think it's what I said earlier. There just seem to always be other priorities. You know, in the federal budget, we saw this $30 billion for childcare, which I think is a good initiative. I personally think investing in childcare is one of the best ways to spend health money to ensure kids grow up healthier. But I think what was missing, and I wrote about this in the paper, I think what was missing was the other end of the spectrum. Surely we could be spending this amount of money on keeping our elders safe and showing them some respect in their older years. This is the generation that built our Medicare system, that built all these social programs. We should stop forsaking them. So I think, while I like that initiative, I would have liked to see something equal at the other end of the spectrum. But, back to your question about why do we forget this? I'm not exactly sure. I was shocked when the Long-Term Care Commission came out in Ontario with a report. Nothing surprising in it. It's the same as the 150 other reports. But still, as far as I know, the Premier of Ontario has still not said a word about that report. The Long-Term Care Minister came out briefly, answered 3 questions, and fled the media because she didn't like the questions about the response to the report. So I think it is really troubling. And like you, I say to myself, We've had about 25,000 COVID deaths in Canada. 17,000 of those have been in these institutions. They've been in long-term care. So the vast majority. And if 17,000 deaths of our grandmothers and our grandfathers, if that doesn't change something, well, nothing ever will. So then we should despair. Now, I haven't totally given up hope. I think we can still keep working on this, plugging away. We can't pay too much attention to short-term thinking in budgets. We have to look at this being a long-term policy plan. But boy, the governments really have to start taking this seriously.
But there's something about the public, though, because governments obviously don't feel any political pressure. And I think this is interesting because long-term care, first of all, just axiomatically affects a lot more people, or elder care affects a lot more people than child care does. Touches and reaches a lot more people. And secondly, I remember polling for Kathleen Wynne and finding that when people got over the age of 50, there were very, very few things that were as concerning to them as long-term care and the quality of long-term care. Probably both dealing with their parents' situation and then anticipating their own. Anxiety levels about the long-term care system are actually very high among people under 45. Nobody even thinks about it. But once you start to hit about 50, it becomes a preoccupation. But it doesn't have any political expression, that preoccupation. This has never been a political issue. I don't remember an election campaign fought over it. I don't remember a big announcement ever made by anybody that had political clout to it. So it's is it because we're in denial? We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to think about it, maybe even. But it's weird to me that the issue which reaches so many people, which people know is so horrible, and which people are so dreading, finds no political expression.
Yeah, it is a fascinating paradox. And I think a part of it is what you said. I think a lot of it is we don't want to admit that we're going there, right? So I think before COVID, people were reluctant. They had their doubts about long-term care, and now they're downright fearful. So is that going to make them vote differently? I'm not sure. I think it is ultimately up to the public to say, listen, you're going to live or die on this issue as a government. And we've never done that as a public. We've always allowed other things to take priority. So I think, some of it falls back on the public, our reluctance to admit that we're going to need this kind of care. I think a lot of it comes back to we think a bit too individually rather than collectively about this issue. We worry, okay, well, I'm going to take care of my grandmother or my mother, and that's okay, I'm covered. And I say this in the book. I say I think the big challenge here and the big solution is to think collectively the way we think individually. Everybody loves their mom. Everybody loves their grandma. They want them to be cared for in the best way possible. Well, why don't we think that for everyone and not just our own family? So I think Canadians, have really good values. I think they think they respect their elders, but they just have to do it in policy as well. And ultimately, we have to say to ourselves, I'm going to make this matter during the election campaign. And what takes precedent? Well, we start talking about debt, et cetera. And if you're going to fix this, it's going to cost a lot of money. Let's be honest about that. And then people get kind of cold feet. Oh, well, maybe we should do something else, keep the debt down, et cetera. So all kinds of other things come to overtake it. So I don't think it's an issue that Canadians don't care. I think they do care, but they just get overtaken. I think one of the great problems is we just feel overwhelmed. We feel that there's too much to do. It's not fixable. And that's really, to me, that was one of the main points that I did this book, is to say, this is really fixable. It's doable. It's not that difficult to fix. We know all the problems. We know all the solutions. I don't think it's unaffordable at all. It'll cost some money, but we spend a lot of money delivering bad elder care now. We could spend that money a lot smarter. So I think, to me, the solutions are all at hand. And this could be, if there's some momentum, some political momentum, some public momentum, this could really change quickly. One of the most uplifting things to me, I've been doing this virtual book tour, so sitting at home doing shows like this. One of the most uplifting things to me has been the interest of younger people in this issue. People, young millennials, Gen Xers, just saying, listen, I'm sickened by what's happening to my grandmother. I haven't been able
Right.
to see her for a year. Her friends are dying. I'm not going to stand for this. Once you have, you know this, you know politics better than I. Once you have this cross-generational interest in an issue, things really accelerate quickly. So to me, that's where the hope lies.
Right. Is it, you mentioned money, so let's just deal with the money thing. Is it prohibitively expensive to deal with? A number leapt out at me. You said, I think in the book, that it would cost about $1.8 billion in Ontario to bring 4 hours of daily care to reality. So just doing that, just bringing people up to 4 hours of care a day would cost about $2 billion without touching any of the other things in the system that would need to be touched. So that starts to make me think we are talking very large sums of money to have a system that we would be comfortable with.
I think
Not that scares me, but it's just...
I think, first of all, you have to decide what you want to fund before you can figure out if it's expensive, right? So I think we have to do that. We have to cost out, here's what an initiative costs. To do 4 hours, $2 billion. Is that reasonable? I think so. I don't think that's unreasonable in the grand scheme of things. We have to remember how much we spend now. We spend 10, 20, $30 billion on elder care. We get very little value. So I think, to me, the way to figure out if it's affordable is to look at other countries. So other countries that do this well, they actually have lower healthcare budgets than Canada. So it's not, you can't just look at elder care in isolation. You have to look at the system and say, well, how can we prevent people from we spend a whole bunch of money on homes. How can we prevent them from being there in the first place? Well, we spend better on home care. Well, how do we have better home care? Well, we provide some support for caregivers so that they can stay at home without burning out and dying. So it's not, you can't fix one thing in isolation, and you can't measure out the cost of something in isolation. And then finally, you have to remember, what are the consequences of not doing these things? So what's the cost of all these women being removed from the economy, not having jobs because they're caregiving? Again, I come back to the childcare initiative in the federal budget. Good initiative, but as I noted, there are more women caring for older adults than there are caring for children in this country. They have the same issues. In fact, they have bigger issues because they're further advanced in their careers. They're taking more out of the economy. We're losing their pension contributions, et cetera. So there are costs to all this neglect, and it is really systemic neglect of elders. The final thing is, these are people, older people have been paying their taxes for 30, 40 years, and that's what insurance is about. It's about cashing in when you need it at the end, right? So they've been paying in. There is a responsibility to them. You can't just say, oh, it costs money. Well, they've paid this. They've paid it over a half a century, and it's time to collect. And we have to have a system that does that pays people, that cares for them in a way they've been investing their whole lives.
Okay. Let's separate the wheat from the chaff a little bit. You said we can't do everything. We have to decide what we want to do. A lot of chatter, both at the expert level community. I had Pat Armstrong on the show, and we talked about this, and I see a lot of it on Twitter, obviously, about profit homes versus nonprofit homes. And there seems to be a pretty strong consensus that while there are variances within, that on balance, nonprofit homes performed better than profit homes through the pandemic. They both performed badly, but nonprofit homes were better. I don't see any reason why elder care should be a business rather than a societal responsibility. But is this an important thing to do while we're trying to improve this system for elderly people? We're trying to find the money to do important things. Do we actually need this profit component of it, or would we be better off to start by slicing it out?
Yeah, so I'll answer this on several levels because I get asked this question often. So first of all, I worry about people trotting out something like this as a panacea. So if we got rid of all for-profit homes tomorrow, would the world of our elders be any better? No, it wouldn't. It would still be terrible. So it's an issue. Ownership matters, but to me, it's well down the list of things that we have to fix. Second of all, rather than say get rid of for-profit operators. I don't think we need them. A lot of countries don't have them. A lot do. I don't think they're necessary. But to me, the question is, why are they there? And the reason they're there is because governments don't like to invest in real estate. They don't like to build buildings. They don't like debt. So what's the solution to that? Well, the solution is we have to think differently about debt, or we have to have the formula be different. So I think the Long-Term Care Commission actually had a very good recommendation on this, one that's been made many times before. And it's, we have to separate the real estate from the care component. So to me, we should absolutely have no for-profit care providers. That shouldn't be a question. But we have this weird intermingling in Canada where if you own the building, you have to provide the care. So let's break those two components off. I don't care who builds the building, if they make profit, et cetera. For-profit is normal in our housing sector in Canada. So let's let them build homes, but people who do speculate in real estate shouldn't be delivering care to our grandmothers. That's where we have to make the distinction. So in the book, I say, essentially, the problem to me isn't private operators. There's a lot of family-owned homes that are excellent. Those are technically for-profit homes. The problem is we have a small percentage of essentially slum landlords, people who are just making money off the land, off the rentals, and they don't really care about who's in the room. They're just widgets to them. Those are the horrible providers of care because they don't care about people. Those are the ones we have to get out. So rather than say, let's get rid of profit altogether, I said, let's get profit out of care provision and let's do the home building, the ownership as a different part of the equation. So I think if we split those two up, and other provinces have done this better, then we're going to have better outcomes. The final thing I'll say about for-profit not being getting rid of it, not being a panacea, Quebec has virtually no for-profit care. It's almost all state-owned homes called CHSLDs in Quebec. They had the worst outcomes in the country. It was their homes were ravaged and they were all owned by the state, et cetera. So it's not a magic solution. So it's sort of a long answer, but it is, I always worry when we have these simplistic solutions to complex problems. I think we have to do a lot in this sector, and that's not, to me, the number one priority.
What did extended care do to get run out of the United States?
Well, I think a lot of these homes, I think what they do is what I said, is they care about the real estate, they care about having the monthly income, and they upsell stuff. Like if you get in these homes, you can be, you pay a basic rate, but then you can be just charged all kinds of things every month. We're going to, you're having a little more trouble walking, that's going to be 3 more hours of care a week. And then all of a sudden you see your bill go from $2,000 a month to $15,000 a month. And this happens in Canada too. There's just the upselling and the addition of care. And a lot of that is just bad regulation, et cetera. So I don't know specifically what extended care did, but the industry, like any big industry, has people who exploit to make money.
It's ironic because people often complain about hospitals, but my research indicates that people think that long-term care, the care in long-term care homes should be comparable to hospitals. What are the pros and cons of putting long-term care under the Canada Health Act?
Well, the Canada Health Act, again, is just some guidance. It's actually the rules that are established for the feds transferring money to the provinces. We've made it into this grandiose set of principles, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. So the pros and cons are we would provide care, I think, more equitably. If it was under the Canada Health Act. So we would have, if we made it a home care an essential service, the way hospital and physician care is, then there would be more access, more equity, et cetera. I think the downside of it would be once you open the Canada Health Act, I think you open a Pandora's box. And if you're going to put home care in there, why not pharmacare? Why not home care? Why not rehabilitation? Why not vision care? I think that the debate would just go off the rails pretty quickly. So I think the solution is more the federal government investing in kind of a parallel type program. We're going to provide money for long-term care, for elder care, because I don't think they should just support just institutional care. So we're going to provide money for elder care. And then if you want that as a province, you have to meet the following standards. For example, 4 hours of care a day, etc. So there's ways of doing this without opening the Canada Health Act. But the broader question you're asking is, and it's a question we don't ask often enough, is what should be publicly funded? So I am not arguing here that everyone's long-term care should be free, as doctor care is, because there is a component of housing there. You do have to pay for your housing. I don't think that's unreasonable, but the care should be provided. Any necessary care should be provided under Medicare, and it's not now. We would provide about roughly 200. We give the state spends about $200 a day on a person who's in care, and about 2/3 of that goes to the actual care, and the other to the other stuff. So I don't think we provide an adequate amount of money, about $160 a day, to provide decent care. In a hospital, it's maybe $800 a day. So it's significantly more that we spend, and there needs to be more balance there. The other thing I'll say on this point is long-term care homes should not be hospitals, right? They should be places where people live. I think one of the worst things about our care homes in Canada is that they look like hospitals, or at the good ones. The bad ones look like prisons more than anything else, but they should be homes. They should be smaller facilities that look like homes, but provide necessary aid to the people who can't carry out their activities of daily living. So I think that's the countries that do this well. Again, people live in home-like settings, and they're provided the care they need, but the quality of life is the focus, not the medical care. So nobody wants to live in a hospital, and we shouldn't turn our long-term care homes into essentially what they are now, which is hospitals without hospital care.
Right. Actually, one of the things that really surprised me in your book was to the extent to which hospital beds are long-term care beds. How many people that aren't acutely ill are living in hospital beds because there's no place for them to go, and the hospitals don't mind having them there because they're low maintenance. You said sort of cheap tenants.
Yeah, it's something we even have a terminology for it in Canada: alternate level of care. So ALC patients, and these are people who are, as you said, they're living in hospitals because there's nowhere for them to go. They've gotten sick. They can't go back home because they're not well enough. There's no home care available. There's no place in the local long-term care home. So they just kind of, literally fester in hospitals. The last count, there was roughly 7,500 people, ALC patients in Canada, so several hospitals worth. And as you said, there is a perverse incentive there for hospitals. They're not you don't cost a lot of money to take care of because we don't do anything for them. But imagine everybody's probably visited a hospital. Imagine living there. Just living there, there's no activities, very few visitors. You're just living in a hospital room. Somebody comes in with your tray of Jell-O and whatever mush a couple of times a day, depending on, most people in that situation have dementia. Maybe somebody come in and change your continence pad. That's it. That's your contact with the outside world. I wrote about a patient once who had lived in a hospital for 10 years, if you can imagine.
No, I can't.
To me, it's just, it's gross.
What was their mental state?
Sorry?
What was their mental state?
Just a person with a severe disability, but they could certainly, they could interact. They had conversations.
I mean at the end of that, at the end of 10 years of living it off.
You're a mess. You're a mess. You just don't have a life. It's not, you have no quality of life. It's terrible.
Right. Okay. So let's get to the meat of the policy solution here, which is, you're very persuasive in your book, and I had been preconditioned by other things I've read about this, that the real answer is deinstitutionalization, is serious attempt at keeping people in their homes as long as possible, or in a home as long as possible, because I presume there's a role for multi-generational living here, something Kathleen Wynne wrote an article about. But what is, it looks like this is when you talk about things that appear daunting, this appears daunting to me. Like the home care system is so fragmented, so inadequate, that it seems hard for me to see how we get from here to there. So what is the path to a better deinstitutionalized home care centered system?
Yeah, so the path, I think it starts with something we talked about at the outset. It starts with a philosophy. It starts with the philosophy that well, we value our elders. We want them to be part of society until the very end. So we're all going to die, but we all want to be active members of our community as long as possible. So once you have that philosophy, and again, countries that do elder care well, that's what they do. They have this philosophy. We care about elders. We want them to be visible and present in our lives. And once you have that philosophy, everything else to me is pretty well just plumbing, right? It's like give life to your beliefs, to your values. So I think it's actually simple enough on paper. So once you have this idea, then you can do it. So what you have to do on paper? Well, you have to say, we're going to invest a lot in home care because we want people to stay home. So in Canada, we spend about 80% of our elder care budget on institutionalization. In a country like Denmark, it's 80% on home care. So it's the same amount of money. We spend it differently. They don't say nobody needs an institution. Lots of people do eventually. If you have advanced dementia, et cetera, you need 24/7 care. No question that you need an institution. But then you say, what do they look like? Well, they look like homes and they're in the community. So again, you go to Denmark, you have a care home. Where is it? It's beside a school, or it's beside a daycare center, because you want kids to see old people. In our society, we don't see a lot of old people. There's so many people with dementia in Canada, you should see them every single day. That should be the reality, but we don't. We hide them away. So you have this idea that this matters, and we adapt society to their needs. So I think so practically, how do you deinstitutionalize? It's you have that philosophy, you invest in home care programs, you invest in supportive housing. So people, say we live in our family home, we have trouble navigating the stairs, et cetera. We want to move. Well, what happens in Canada is you get fast tracked to this institution. Suddenly you're living, sharing a bathroom with 8 other people after living in your family home for 50 years. There has to be an in-between there. The in-between is what? Well, it's maybe an apartment building where the home care workers live in the building. We have examples of this in Canada that are excellent. So you don't have to go to a big institution. You don't need hospital care. You just need a little help. Every Wednesday, maybe you need help with your groceries or having a shower, et cetera. So that you have more of a continuum. In Canada, there's nothing between home. There's almost nothing between home and a long-term care facility. We have to really fill in that space. And again, we have lots of community groups doing work there, but they're not supported. So it's a whole series of small measures that do this. And to get back to your initial question, yes, it seems daunting, but it's not that daunting because we're doing all of this and we're doing it all successfully, but we're doing it on a small scale. So to me in Canada, that's the overall problem in our healthcare system is we never scale up our successes. And we do a lot of things tremendously. I always call Medicare islands of excellence in a sea of mediocrity. And that's what we have to do. We have to expand these islands of excellence, and we have to get rid of the mediocrity over time. And that's exactly what we have to do with elder care as well.
So my mind, as you were talking, went to compensation, Andre, because, home care, one of the things I know that elderly people hate, and I know that my mom hated, is different people coming in all the time to help you shower, help you get dressed, all this kind of stuff. You'd like to have consistency, a person that's good at their job and that you can have a relationship with. Because the other thing about being old is loneliness. My God, the loneliness that occurs among elderly people. So these are companions as well. So when I say it takes me to compensation is then I want a home care worker who's not going to quit because they can make as much money in a fast food restaurant or quit because they can make $2 or $3 more working in a meat processing plant. I want somebody that likes their job, sees it as a vocation, and is going to be doing it for year after year after year so that I can develop that consistency with home care. But that requires a whole different approach to that job and what we pay and how we credentialize it and everything, isn't it?
Yeah, so you're right. The continuity of care really matters. It mattered to my mom a lot. So, like many families, we ended up hiring our care worker privately so that we could pay her a little extra and make sure that it was the same person, not someone new every week doing your mom's shower, right? So that stuff really matters. You've had Pat Armstrong on your show. She's the guru in this sector, and she has a famous saying. She says, the conditions of work are the conditions of care. So if we want our elders to be well cared for, we have to take care of their workers. That's a fundamental issue. And we don't do that. We treat them as widgets, as disposable. So once you get the workforce, then you do have continuity if you do pay them well, et cetera. But it's not just about pay. I talk to many, many care providers, and they don't complain about their pay that much. They complain about, I don't have time to care the way I'd like to. And they're crushed. These personal support workers, a lot of them come from the Philippines, et cetera. They're very caring people and they want to be able to help, but they say, I'm only given 15 minutes to do a task that takes an hour. And that's the problem. We have to give people control. Once you have control of your work, you do a much better job. Everybody knows that, right? So we have to, I don't know if this is a word, but kind of de-widgetize this sector. Everything is so checklisty. You have to do the following 3 things, and whether the person wants them or not. And as you said, one of the most valuable things is addressing the isolation. In countries where they have really good care, one of the main things the caregivers do is they come in and they have a cup of tea with the person, and then they figure out what they need, right? It's not like I'm here and you're going to get your bath whether you want it or not. We're going to sit down and talk about what you need today. I have 3 hours, and what are we going to do? And again, we do this in Canada. We have little pockets where they do this, and the care is not more expensive, and the care is far, far better because people just get what they want. They don't get all this other stuff. In home care, we spend 1/3 of the home care budget in Canada doing administration, trying to decide how to not give people actual care. If we put that it's a perversity. It's like our home care sector is run like HMOs in the US, where you spend an enormous amount of money figuring out how to not deliver care. If you just, give the workers some stability, you give them some freedom, you let them talk to people, it's amazing how quickly things change. There's a Dutch model called Bertzorg, which is exactly like this. Nurses come in, what do you need? And, it doesn't cost anymore because say you have in Ontario, for example, you're allowed 3 hours a day of care. You can do a lot in that 3 hours, but you can't do it if it's one person coming for 1 hour, 3 different people for 1 hour doing different things. Right. That doesn't work. So it
becomes entirely transactional, right?
Yeah.
It's not a relationship. It's a transaction.
We need person-centered care, not transactional care, or emotional focused care is the popular jargon these days. But essentially, you just need to ask people what they want. And there's this, we have a belief in our system, in our rules, is a belief that people are going to rip off the system. And every bit of research tells us that the opposite is true. The people always ask far less than they really need. So we have to get away with this notion that everybody, every 85-year-old is a cheater and they're going to ask for 4 hours of care when they only need 2. It's quite the contrary. We have to just ask people what they need. Some of this stuff is so basic and simple, and we just don't do it.
So the budget actually did have a fair bit of money for elderly people. It increased the GIS, and gave I think a one-time measure to seniors as well. Why was that important? What's the allocation of resources there? If you're going to give money to elderly people, what was the impetus to give it to them in income rather than in these kind of support services?
I think we've actually done a tremendous job in Canada in bolstering the income of older people over the recent years, and that's made a tremendous difference. We know the single most important thing for our health is having a decent income. So I think those measures are really, really important to give people the ability to feed themselves, perhaps to purchase some care, et cetera. So these initiatives are really important, but again, they're always done in isolation. So yes, it's good to bolster the income of seniors, but let's make sure the right people are getting help and think this through. What are we not doing, and what can we do better?
Right. So this hour has blown by, Andre. I want to thank you so much for this. I do want to ask you one non-LTC related question before we go, because you're the foremost expert that I'm going to be able to talk to. And I'm trying to figure out what 1-dose summer, 2-dose fall means. And I was wondering if you might lay out for us what Canadians can expect for the rest of 2021. What is life like for the rest of 2021?
Well, I'll try gazing into my crystal ball. I'm a great believer in the philosopher Yogi Berra, who said, I don't like to make predictions, especially about the future. But I think what we should be doing, I don't know if what we will be doing, what we should be doing in the summer is spending a lot of time outside. It's a great place to avoid getting COVID. So let's spend outside, not large gatherings. So this gradual return to life, but the gradual part is important. So I think we have to worry about, we have the 1 dose. So that means a little bit of freedom, but we're not going to go back and have huge parties, folk festivals, Olympics. This stuff shouldn't be happening. There shouldn't be large gatherings. So let's expand our bubbles a little bit and live a lot better than we've been doing the last year, but look forward to that 2nd dose and a very slow, gradual opening up of society and getting back to work, and hopefully doing things differently, just having better policies, better ways of doing infection control, being more thoughtful going forward. And I think we also have the final thing, maybe it's not a good positive note to end on. I think we have to steel ourselves for the possibility that bad things happen again and we have to shut down. And we have to, if that's necessary.
What would cause that? What would cause that?
I think the variants being a little too lax, going a little nuts and allowing the virus to get a foothold again. We have to be cognizant of that. That's happening in other parts of the world, even those that have really had control over the pandemic. What's going on in Japan right now is sort of disturbing, for example. So I think we have to not make the mistake of just dragging our feet again if that happens. Lock down quickly, get it under control, and then go back to our plan towards a 2-dose fall.
When I have 2 doses, am I invulnerable?
No one is invulnerable. These are not magical potions, but what ultimately we'll want to do, the goal is to make sure there's not much virus circulating. I think COVID is here to stay. But it's going to be more like the flu. There's going to be little pockets of outbreaks, and we can protect ourselves. So I think we have to look at it as something, we really have to get it, crush it, get it out of our daily lives. And then after that, it's much, much easier to manage.
Are these vaccines different from other vaccines? Can I get measles? Is it possible for me to catch the measles?
It's almost impossible for you to catch the measles if you've had the vaccine or if you've, like me, had the measles as a child. But it's a different virus. So the viruses are not created equal. So measles is kind of the dream virus in that once you get your protection, once you get your immunity, it's forever. For many, many other viruses, it's not forever, and it's not 100%. But even, we have these vaccines, 90%, some effective, maybe a little less with the variants, but that's still good. We can still keep the lid on them. And once it's not circulating in the community, life would be very, very different.
Great. Thank you so much. I can't thank you enough. And please, everybody, go out and read this book, Neglected No More. Because it's a hugely important subject matter. This book lays out the crisis in long-term care, the crisis in elder care, and unusually for one of these books, has an equal amount of time devoted to potential solutions. Well worth the read, and vote on this issue in the next election, please. Andre, thank you for coming on. Really appreciate it. So informative.
And thank you for the conversation.
Great. Take care. I want to talk for a minute here about walking the walk where our environment is concerned. If you've ever been on a highway during the summer driving season, you must have noticed all the trucks. On the I-95, which runs the entire length of the U.S. eastern seaboard, it almost seems like one of the lanes is permanently reserved for tractor trailers. A bumper-to-bumper queue running hot, stretching out of sight all the way from Maine to Miami. Those tens of thousands of long-haul trucks help feed our consumer society's demands for just about everything. But they come with a price. They are major polluters, and there's no way to sugarcoat that. And you know, there is a better way. Trains. Over the years, trains have become longer and more fuel efficient. The average train of a Class 1 railroad is now 1.5 miles long, often longer. And because of physics, things like momentum, those trains are a much cleaner way to transport just about everything. The fact is, one train, can take hundreds of tractor-trailer trucks off the highway. Our sponsor, CN, is a Class 1 railway. It is also focused on using technology to become ever more efficient. CN trains already consume about 15% less fuel than the railroad industry average. Right now, CN is in talks to merge with another Class 1, Kansas City Southern. The result, CN hopes, will be the first truly North American railway, one reaching from one Canadian coast to the other and down through the American Midwest deep into Mexico. The future of our continent is connected, and it simply has to be sustainable. That's CN's commitment. Hey, Tuesday morning. It's Jenni and Scott. Good morning, folks. How are you?
Hi, good morning.
Oh, do. Show people your shirt, David. Show people your shirt.
Oh my God,
you're a prideful man today. Show people your shirt.
I'm very excited. There's a seminal moment in rock and roll history on the A Man Must Carry On album when Jerry Jeff is about to break into a kick-ass version of LA Freeway when he bellows out, "Turn me loose, I'll never be the same." And Todd Snyder's written a song called that, based on that song, and I got the shirt. So there you go. I'm very excited. Jenni, as always, is dressed for a different pod.
Completely.
Altogether.
She's like, women in finance. You're in the wrong place.
All right, I'll dress down for next week, I promise.
I was with you when we bought this shirt. We took David, Jenni, for his 50th birthday, which was some time ago. I think, it was back in a distant decade. We took David for his 50th birthday to Austin and saw the Austin City Limits Festival. Millions of great musical acts that we saw. And I bought this T-shirt. It's with me still. I never throw T-shirts out. I just wear them until one of us dies. And so there's a lot of good memories from this T-shirt. A lot of good memories. Remember that house we rented that had that big trapeze? Remember? She had a big trapeze set up in it. It was like
awfully strange.
Yeah. It's Austin. It's weird, man. But that was a lifestyle I wasn't really tapping into.
Keep Austin weird. Scott, you're shorn.
I'm shorn. I am.
You're shorn.
I am shorn of hairs. I got my head. I think last time I was on, I had no hair, right? I got rid of my hair. And then later that day, I looked a little like Lennon. So later that day, I got rid of the beard and I'm all shaved down. And now
Not John Lennon, but Vladimir Lenin.
No, I was thinking John, actually. I was thinking Fool on the Hill. So now I can pass in polite society. Except, of course, there's no polite society to integrate with, so...
I will say that you look quite a bit younger.
My mom thinks I look older, but I don't know. My mom is old, so maybe she's just
you look good. You look much better.
Well, I feel like a new man, as John Turner would say.
Not after a haircut.
No.
That's not what he would say after a haircut.
That's right. He'd be picking the seeds of the night before out of his teeth. I love him.
Jenni, got a prediction for the series? Big series starting on Thursday.
So did you guys watch the Laval Rockets game last night? Because I didn't. All I saw, though, I sent you guys the report. Carey Price looked great after letting in 2 quick goals at the start. And I'm like...
I couldn't believe that story. You said, I know.
In the AHL.
I didn't send it because I thought
Not
it was
against
good.
Matthews.
That's why I did the ...
Yeah. I got that. I didn't know.
Yeah, I don't know. My dad is optimistic. He's like, you never know what's going to happen. It's playoff hockey. So I'm hoping he's more right than what I'm feeling.
I don't know, man. My 11-year-old is so pumped. It's all he thinks about. It's all that he talks about. Turned to me the other day watching a TV show. He stopped. He paused the show. He rolls around on the couch and looks back at me earnestly and says, Dad, I've been thinking about it, and I think the Habs could win. I really genuinely think the Habs could win. And I was like, well, son, I've got so many ways that I'm going to disappoint you. We might as well start now. But we'll see. I mean, I just don't see how, unless Carey Price steals the series and the guy's coming off a concussion and he's never carried the Habs through the playoffs. So, I don't see how it happens. Gallagher's back. That's great. They're going to hack at that thumb like it's a Douglas fir and he's going to go down. So I hope I'm proven wrong. I want them to win, but I'm not betting much on it.
Well, put on your jersey, Jenni. Put on your jersey because absent goaltending, this is a 5-game series. In the Leafs' favor. And if Carey Price ever wants to be Ken Dryden, this is his last chance.
Well, I believe buying that jersey was the start of all the problems, so I'm not sure whether anyone else would it.
It's a Horcrux. You've cursed us.
Knowing them, they're going to start in their fucking blue jerseys or something.
Yeah. I think they agree that those things need to be driven to the bottom of the quarry and left there to die. Are we going to, I know, David, I know there's politics. I know that people talk about politics on this podcast. They expect us to talk about politics on this podcast. But are we going to permit the most important story of not just this week, but of this civilization, of history? Are we going to permit the
UFOs?
Most important story? Yes, exactly.
UFOs?
Well,
I don't understand where that story is. Like, why isn't that the biggest story in the world? Why isn't that the biggest story in the world?
No kidding. And let's not indulge the skeptics by saying UFOs. Let's use the UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon. We're not trying to attract the kooks here, people. We're just giving you the straight goods. That 60 Minutes report, June 1st, we've got the release of the Pentagon. They're going to disclose their files. Look, man, they're out there. The creatures are traveling through time and space, possibly across other dimensions, and they are monitoring us. Now, it could also be the Chinese, but I prefer the people from the other dimensions. That's where I'm interested in. And I just don't understand why people aren't talking about this breathlessly. I don't know how we live in a world where people can go, well, if I already said, there was a story in the New York Times about that last year, so it's not news anymore. But civilizations from another solar system with little tiny ships that move in through the water and in the air.
I know. I'm as excited about it as you are. I made Terry sit down and watch 60 Minutes with me. I'm that excited about it. But Jenni appears to have been scrolling Twitter for the last 3 minutes while we talk about this. So
that's fine. When the lizard masters show up, I'll say, forget her. Put her to work. Put her to work extracting glucose or whatever you people are here for. I'll be one of your lieutenants.
Listen, things are getting so bad for Jason Kenney. I'm starting to feel sorry for him out there in Alberta, to be honest. I mean, it is like terrible polls, terrible media, caucus divided, broken up, had to expel 2 members of the caucus, including the caucus chair. He's besieged by the right wing and rural members on one side and besieged by city voters on the other side. He's in a real, and this is partly a product of his government, but also partly a product of the nature of Alberta right now. How does he get out of this? How does he get out of this spiral that he's in?
Well, so yeah, it isn't great for Jason, and the last kind of couple weeks are more directed at him. I've always felt that the coverage of Jason's handling of COVID has been unfair, considering the media will focus on Alberta when BC has had a much similar approach. Their mask mandate came late. Oregon had an election, called an election, and then cases skyrocketed. I think if that had been Jason Kenney, I think that it would have led national news. And with Oregon, it was like not even a mention. Most people probably don't even fully realize that. But I think the issue that Jason does have in terms of in terms of his voter coalition and then in terms of his caucus is there's a real divide in terms of lockdown measures over COVID. That's kind of how it started. It's unlike Doug. Doug's caucus, and I know we're going to probably talk about Doug. Doug's caucus has for the most part been pretty supportive, at least externally, in terms of what the government's doing. And Jason's caucus is a little bit different, and it's the merging of the two parties. I think that we've talked about this before. You can't underestimate the skill or the how good Stephen Harper was in terms of making sure that both parts of our coalition, after we merged in 2004, were brought together. And I'm not sure that Jason and his team have done that as aptly with the PC Party and the Wild Rose. And I think you're seeing that now. Yesterday, he also there was an issue. 3 of his caucus members came out and called on the federal government to criticize Israel and with the war or the escalation in Gaza, which did not sit well with a lot of other people in caucus. And I know I saw a lot of chattering people that are very supportive generally of Jason, saying, okay, so you kick 2 guys out that are just anti-lockdown, and you're not doing anything to punish these 3 guys that have taken a position when there's anti-Semitic incidents going on in Edmonton. People are knocking on people's doors and asking them if they're Jewish, and so I think that's going to be. And I'll just end it by saying I did find Jason. He was asked about this yesterday at his press conference, and his answer was something like, he obviously denounced the anti-Semitism that's going on in terms of rallies and door knocking on people's doors. But he said, I don't want to intervene. Foreign policy is a federal matter. And I just found that was a very, very strange thing for him to say. So anyways, that's a big download. So
interesting. So he didn't want to engage with his caucus on that. He didn't want another front, didn't want to open up another front inside of his own caucus on that, I guess.
But I'm not really sure why. Jason's position on Israel has been pretty. Jason's position on Israel has been pretty solid, and so I'm not sure why he would use the line of this is not provincial jurisdiction, therefore I'm not going to comment. The premier's comment on federal jurisdiction.
Yeah, it's not troubled him on other issues.
All the time. There's court cases on Bill C-69 and the carbon tax, which I fully agree with Jason's position on that. I just thought it was a very strange answer for him to give.
Scott, you got 2 impulses here. You got I've got to solidify my party and get them to be a unified force behind me going into another election. And I've got to improve my poll numbers. I've got to get more competitive with the NDP. Is there an ordering to that?
I would think, in theory, at minimum, practice can be harder because you've got unpredictable issues you have to deal with. But in theory, you would say solidify your base and then turn to being more appealing in the broad electorate. I think the challenge he's got. Jenni knows better than I do, and she made a point which I think is really important, which is that it isn't just about COVID, right? I mean, he's confronted by a whole host of deep challenges. I think I think that the fragility of bringing together the parties into one united party, I think the fragility of that coalition, of that unique coalition, has been particularly exposed by COVID because there is such resistance to lockdown measures. And so it becomes a point where people feel enabled, they feel empowered to talk about it and to disagree. And there isn't a culture of saying, no, sorry, you got to hold your tongue and fight the big fight together. And I think part of it has got to do, like, you're trying to assemble a coalition that includes those Wild Rose guys. And so, I think a lot of populist, particularly right of center politicians have for the past decade or so, maybe longer, indulged in this kind of, let's tell people what they want to hear. And all politicians do that, obviously. But I mean, when the contradiction between Kenney as a default position, as a political agent for years and years and years. His default position has always been sort of libertarian. His default position is, you know what, people ought to have choice. People ought to be able to do what they want. And so that made him, plus the combination of being someone who was skilled as a political operator and had served in government, that combination made him uniquely well suited to bring together those two parties. But COVID has forced him to abandon the talk of choice and suit up with his obligations as premier to say there's a broader collective public health interest, and he's just not being able to manage that. And you got a caucus that has felt, at least portions of it, that have felt that they are able and they are more than willing to repeat things that are simply not the case, certainly aren't true, and they'll do it in defiance of their own leader and their own premier. And so I don't know how he gets to the business of building the coalition. I don't know if those guys take seriously the threat of failing. Like, you know, I mean, I think one of the
well, why wouldn't they? Let me just interrupt you. Why wouldn't they? Because who's the last successful conservative premier of Alberta? Ralph Klein. Right? Ralph Klein. Prentice lost. Redford was run out of office by her own party. Stelmach was run out of office by his own party. Thereafter, Kenney. It looks like that's 20 years now. It looks like it's pretty hard for conservatives, ironically, to form a cohesive governing coalition in Alberta.
Well, let me just, and then turn over to Jenni, who's a better place to talk about this. But one thought I have is that, I mean, literally, they don't fear losing the general election, not meaning that they don't think it's possible, but that there's portions of the caucus, there's portions of of his political coalition that don't care if they lose, that they place a higher priority on being able to say, go fuck your hat, than they do on saying, let's all fall in together, chew on our words for a little bit in order to succeed at the grander enterprise of getting reelected. And when you've got people like that, it's very hard to control them. It's very hard to be coherent.
Yeah,
I thought those people were called New Democrats.
Yeah, I don't think there's that many people in that caucus, Scott, to be honest. I think that there are people that they know that they don't support some of the government policies in terms of lockdowns, and they know they're going to win regardless. But I think there is a portion of that caucus that is afraid they could lose. Let's be honest. It's not that long ago that the NDP had a majority government, and I think that's the issue. I think people don't support the policies, and and we're seeing more and more of it in terms of lockdown. And I know Alberta and Ontario are the same. They're very lockdown provinces, and there hasn't been any decline in cases. So there's a lot of people that are going, okay, well, this isn't working. The approach isn't working. It's Doug and Jason are essentially, they've got the same policies in place now, and so. I think that the majority of people that are upset with it, I think it's not a populist thing. I think it's populist in the fact that they're hearing from their constituents that they're unhappy with the lockdown measures. But if I was Jason and I was working for him, I think the number one thing he has to do to kind of start to steer the ship right would be caucus management. And I think that this is part of the issue. This is the crux of the issue, I think, that he has. And we've talked about this, and I've said it, in all the years that Stephen Harper was leader of the Alliance Conservative Party, and while we were in government, he missed 2 caucus meetings in that entire time over 11 years. And so there was always an emphasis put on caucus that we have talked about, and it doesn't seem that Jason has put the same emphasis on caucus. There were reports for the last month that every caucus meeting was being canceled, and so you get the sense that there's no outlet for caucus to be able to communicate, to be able to tell the leader, to tell Jason what they're hearing from their constituents and what their concerns are. So if there is no outlet, and if there is no way for these caucus members to communicate with the leader, because my guess is if they're not having caucus members because they don't want to hear blowback from caucus, my guess is it's not the premier's office isn't on the phone calling people individually. So if you leave caucus with no outlet, then you end up in a situation where 16 MLAs write a public letter to the premier stating that they're unhappy with government policy because they feel they have no other choice.
Well, I buy that, but isn't there something more fundamental than I for sure buy that. I'm sure that caucus management is poor and could be better. But isn't there something more fundamental going on? Isn't there something inherent in the coalition out there that's uniquely exposed by COVID, where, part of the core message track for that coalition, and Jason was happy to verbalize it for periods of time, is, fuck all the elites, screw the downtown smarties, everybody who thinks they're expert, all of this, and that kind of defiance of reason, all that stuff, you crash into the rocks of having to rely on people that are expert, reason, doctors, scientists, when it comes to dealing with COVID measures. You said, well, they've had lockdown and nothing's changed. Well, in Ontario, we've gone from 4,000 to 2,000 cases. I think it has changed. And of course, the idea is that you don't go to 7,000 cases. And so I just think you cultivate a culture internally that says we are going to permit people to say, we don't truck and trade and all that sort of bullshit. And then when you have to govern by that, it creates an obvious point of tension. And I mean, it's not everybody, but he's had 2 members resign. He's got others who are up in arms. And I think there's something fundamental in the way in which that coalition was knit together, as compared to Harper, who never super indulged that stuff, moved himself away from some of that kind of stuff. We're not going to hold referendums on everything. I'm not going to tell you all the bullshit that you think is necessarily true. And we are going to be galvanized by the defining project of trying to secure power. And I just think... I think there's something fundamental in how much people have allowed the voice of extremist elements to surface and become mainstream in the coalitions.
Fuck you, Scott. Saying extremist elements within the UCP, that is completely unfair. And the reason why people in the West have the feelings of that they do. So we're talking about a problem that Jason has within his caucus, and you're talking about extremist element. What extremist?
Yeah.
What?
Well, people that say that wearing masks is bullshit, and that we shouldn't have lockdowns, and that we shouldn't be following science. This is a pretty heavy...
I say we shouldn't have lockdowns. Okay.
Well, I think it's bullshit.
Well, I think your position is bullshit because, and I don't want to get back into caucus. I don't want to get back into COVID. Look. But there's no scientific evidence. And
I know this sets you off, but you know what? We have a fundamental disagreement. I think that
What set me off is you said...
Wait a second. We're not talking about COVID, you guys. We are talking about Kenney's thing. So go back, Jenni. Keep going.
No, what set me off, Scott, is you trying to say that there are extremist elements in the United Conservative Party, and that is just fucking bullshit.
Okay, sure. All right, fine. I believe that the right-of-center movements, political right-of-center movements, are going to have to come to Jesus on their reliance upon misinformation, on telling people bullshit they want to hear when they know it's bullshit, and feeding that beast, because that beast will at some point turn around and gobble you up. And I think that's partly what's occurring here with Jason.
And it's just right-wing parties.
No, it's not, but it's particularly manifest in right-wing parties. It is particularly manifest in right-wing parties. There's been a willingness to rely on because the anti-elitism as a message, which has a populist appeal, leads you directly into, therefore reject reason, science, all of that sort of expertise, which then takes you into more than happy to traffic in things that simply aren't true. And we get this whole war on reason thing. And it's got a bigger place in right-wing movements than it does in other movements.
Let me put a different hypothesis on the table, which is my view would be that this may not be about the political formulation at all, but about the nature of the province itself. And I think rural Alberta does have a very strong libertarian culture and mythology about itself. The 2 cities in Alberta are becoming multi-million resident, diverse urban centers that don't share that same value system to the same extent. They are Albertans, so they're a little different than big cities elsewhere, but they also have a lot in common with big cities elsewhere. And I think that province is getting hard to govern, particularly if you need to rely on the rural to get elected, as Conservatives do, to marry the desires of urban Alberta and rural Alberta, I think is a very difficult thing. It may be easier for the NDP because, frankly, they win almost exclusively in the cities. So they don't have the same juggling act internally to do. Do you think there's anything to that, Jenny?
Yeah, I think there is something to that. I think that when you look in Edmonton, they have all but one seat in the city, so they still have a healthy opposition. They've got 24 seats, I think that it is. So I think that's entirely true. I think that can be said not just for Alberta, though. I think that there are challenges. I think it's maybe more acute in Alberta, but I think I think those are challenges for all parties in different regions, or some of the bigger ones, BC, Alberta, Ontario, especially.
I think, yeah. I think it's a defining characteristic of contemporary politics, the divide between urban and non-urban, because it includes, there's this distinct political culture in many ways, voting culture in suburban Canada too, where it exists. But I don't know. People some were like, hasn't Mo kind of figured that out for whatever reason? Like the Saskatchewan Party wins in cities.
It's different. It's different. Those cities aren't the same. See, I mean, the cities in Saskatchewan are too small to define the province. So the province is still rural defined mentally. Whereas, and Manitoba has always been, despite its significant rural population, has always been Winnipeg. Always been defined by Winnipeg as the center. It's Alberta that has changed over the years as Edmonton and Calgary went from cities that could be compared to Regina and Saskatoon, but now are compared to Toronto and Vancouver. And so Alberta's the only place, I think, in the West, in the prairies, that has that real big modern urban city on top of traditional rural. And it's a mix that doesn't work well because they're very different mindsets. Anyway, last thing on this. Kenney's going to have a year and a half after our 2-dose fall before an election. Is your feeling at this point that this COVID period is so defining that it will be impossible to distract from that as the election issue? Or is there plenty of time for other issues to come along that the next election in Alberta will be fought on as opposed to COVID?
Yeah, I think it won't. I think Jason is far enough away, and I think I've said this before, that I think that it's far enough away from Election Day that it could be defined by something other than COVID. The issue will be, though, is if it's a spillover on COVID from COVID. So if you have if it does look like inflation rises and then interest rates rise and the debt that Canadians have becomes massive, and you've seen we're going to get to a point where we can only borrow so much, regardless of what the federal government, what the provinces tell us. What Ontario's getting to a 50% net debt, like they're almost getting to the point where they can't borrow money. And so I think that although it might not be COVID, it might be fine. It might be the kind of the hangover of COVID. But I think he's in a better position than someone like Doug, for example, who is going to be this time next year. We're going to be in the middle of a writ, and I think that it'll be still closer in people's minds.
I'm really curious about this question, and I'm curious about it in sort of all respects. I mean, could we have weird surprises? Could we find that people can rebound, that governments can rebound from this because it's such a unique and specific period, and that once there's a bit of distance, maybe even 1 year, let's take Doug, for example, the shortest runway at the provincial level, can they put it behind them? Well, we might see surprises on the other side. Like, is there any chance that Trudeau's going to be more vulnerable in a federal election if he, say, calls one in the fall than we might think? The kind of whole Churchill thing. Thanks very much for your service during the war, but now it's time for us to turn the page. I think it's going to be really interesting. I think one of the key factors will be how much these events alter people's particular perspective on the leader, on that individual leader. So I think it's very easy, even in 12 months, for people to put a bunch of bad feelings about COVID and COVID management behind them. I think it's really easy for people. I think we have short memories. But if people's view of that leader, of Jason Kenney or Doug Ford, is so sunk by that, then what becomes more interesting is, do you end up seeing in the run up to the next election, their own parties going, man, I don't know. We just we feel like we could break free of the gravitational pull of this issue, except for the leader. Do we need to dump the leader? And then when that starts to talk and bubble out, then you get a whole other sort of controversy that weakens your ability to move forward and all that. So we're seeing some of that already in Alberta. I'll be interested to see if it happens in Ontario. If people start to say, you know what, we got to get rid of, we got to dump Doug if we're going to be able to break free of this thing. But I don't dismiss the possibility that we could get surprises that defy our current expectations based on how COVID's been managed.
The whole thing's unprecedented. Why shouldn't the reaction be? Let's see.
Let's see how it goes. Joker's wild.
Yeah. Jenni mentioned caucus management earlier. I read this story yesterday. You know this Hamilton Liberal MP that resigned over the LRT decision? Okay.
Yep.
So I'm not getting into the LRT. I don't know whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing to do for Hamilton, and it's kind of irrelevant. But this guy had been sort of like a longtime opponent. He'd been the mayor of Hamilton and being opposed to this idea. And he says in the article I read yesterday that he heard that the government was funding the LRT project along with the provincial government in the media, that he'd written letters to the respective ministers, never got a response, and then he heard about the decision in the media. So he decided that he didn't have very much influence in the government, so he might as well not run again. You ever heard of something like that?
I've heard, listen, mistakes have happened, usually not to an announcement at that magnitude. That you could have a regional development, agency, dole out some money in an area and have forgotten to tell the local MP or the MP in the adjoining riding, but never for a multi-billion-dollar project that the prime minister was announcing, because it wasn't just the LRT, it was the subway in Toronto. Like it was massive transit projects that they were talking about. So no, but it seems to be par for the course with the caucus management that the Trudeau government has.
Yeah, I think three things. One, you always get these kinds of fuck-ups with governments at all levels and all stripes. Like you'll get this kind of disaffection occur, and people will say, "Well, I didn't know about this," and and I was disaffected, and sometimes that's true because there's been a mistake. Sometimes that's just people talking shit because they're mad about the decision. All kinds of stuff. Two, I think, and we talked about this in a previous pod, I think there's an increasing centralization around the center, right? The centralization of the center. I just think the center matters more in governments all across the country than it used to, particularly when you're in a crisis like we are now.
It's becoming shittier and shittier to be a backbench MP, right?
And people have been saying
all the time it becomes shittier to be a backbench MP. I know we sound old now, right? Because people were saying this 40 years ago, when the first Trudeau said that, when they get 15 minutes off Parliament Hill, they're nobodies. Now the joke is, well, when you're on Parliament Hill, you're a nobody. I don't know if this is the same phenomenon or a different phenomenon, but I do think one thing that's unique is there is a unique characteristic to the Trudeau government, which is the party it was devastated, right? Just think about it from a pure mechanic standpoint. Liberal Party caucus was gone. There was hardly any members left. They're down to 40 members. There wasn't a lot of reservoir of staff, of MPs, of people who had served in a previous government. They didn't have an inherent understanding of how the machinery ought to work, what they would be entitled to demand, what they should have an expectation of in terms of the way in which they're serviced within the government, what they hear, what they don't hear, what they're asked to do, what they're not asked to do. And so it became all about, by virtue of need, Trudeau. Trudeau was the guy, man. He's the biggest name. He's the whole fucking brand. He's the whole deal for the Liberal Party. They surged back to power in 2015, and it's been a very centralized government because that's the way we're going, and because that's the character of this guy. And no one's sitting around the cabinet table going, "Hey, how come this is working this way? This isn't how it used to work," because they don't know. They didn't remember, and so I think. Some of those, it isn't just that some of those muscles have atrophied. In the case of this government, I don't know if some of those muscles ever existed. And so I think that kind of stuff happens. So I think there's a characteristic about this government too.
I disagree it's centralized. I think the centralization and the caucus are two different things. You actually have a government, you've got Trudeau got off on a technicality with the ethics violation because he wasn't part of discussions. I can't imagine in what universe the Prime Minister's office is involved in a discussion about a $900 million program being spent in a pandemic. You've got Guilbeault, who is, because he's a buddy of Trudeau's, is floundering on C10. I can't see that doesn't seem to be directed by the centre. The centre obviously has nothing to do with D&D because they've let basically Sajjan cover up shit all over the place there. So I disagree that it's centralized. I think the caucus thing is different. It's the opposite problem that Jason has. Caucus is willing to eat shit for Trudeau because he is there. To your point, Scott, he is the guy. They know that he remains, regardless of the fact that he's been 2 ethics violations, blackface more times than he can remember, well into his 30s. He still remains the guy. He remains the Liberal Party's #1 asset. So they're willing to sit back and eat shit. And it's the opposite problem that Kenney has.
All right. Speaking of the feds, Scott, you're the comms expert here.
I remember that.
Well, among the 3 of us, you are the most commsy. 1 dose summer, 2 dose fall. What does that mean, and where does that come from? What kind of communications is that?
So I'm glad we're having this discussion right after the discussion we just had, because I think they're of a piece. I think this is all about, we've got a heliocentric, Trudeau-centric government, right? And so I don't think that, so the 1 dose summer, 2 dose fall thing, according to the newspapers, which blows my mind that someone would communicate and share this story, but according to the newspapers, we're told that this meme, this bumper sticker, this sloganeering came directly from the Prime Minister himself. And there was a kind of one of those little TikTok stories about how, people were saying, and we're sitting around and joshing and it was a PM and the PM himself authored this line. Now, I don't know why you would be driven to go and share that story when, at least to my ear, 1 dose summer is a bad bumper sticker. I mean, I put that on my car. I think my car is going to crash into a wall. Like, it's a promise of half as good as you want to the Canadian public, right? Hey, we're in for a 1 dose summer. Like, I don't even think it does justice to what we're actually going to have. Like, I was talking to a friend of mine who runs hospitals the other day, and he was saying, I think we're going to start to see our 2nd dose is going to get moved up. Instead of it being in August for a lot of people, it's going to get into July. We're starting to move. We're getting momentum now. And so I don't know why you would tell people you're only going to get 1 dose and imagine that they would go like, oh, man, that's a crackerjack tune, top of the charts. I love that. 1 dose summer, going to catch on. It's not going to catch on. It's actually an avowal of failure. It's something that's going to irritate people. It's like, no, don't tell me that I have to suffer through this. So if it was the PM slogan, sorry, but boss, someone's got to tell you that it's a bad fucking slogan, okay? So drop it. And the idea that someone would watch the slogan get surfaced, see the response to it, know that it is not working for you, and then say, let's go tell the world that it wasn't our fault, it was the boss's fault. Like, I don't know how that came about, but it was bad, 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 because it's a bad slogan. It's a bad piece of political communication.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think
speaks to the value of focus groups, Jenny.
Yes.
I should do a little advertisement for myself. It speaks to the benefit of focus because it wouldn't have survived one.
No, but
So,
I think
no.
this. I agree with everything there, but I think that Trudeau they've gotten away with stuff like that. They've gotten away with it, but they're not able to get away with stuff like this anymore. I think the CDC's decision of lifting the masks, the mask mandate in the U.S. Really was a eye opener for Canadians. I think there's a lot of Canadians I know that I've talked to that think that certain areas in the States are locked down the same way that Ontario is, the same way that Canada is. And they were willing to accept that. Maybe if they didn't even believe it, they were willing to accept it because it made them feel better. But now they're seeing it's not the case. They're seeing what 2 doses is doing in the U.S. They're seeing full stadiums at baseball games. Look at the Predator Hurricanes game last night. It was a packed. It looked like before times what a playoff hockey would look like. And so I think that as the more awareness that the world is actually opening up and Canada is not, the kitschy slogans of 1 dose summer, 2 dose fall, like just wait, in another 6 months we'll be there. But part of the problem also is they released that slogan around the same time that Theresa Tam came out and said, we'll be able to reopen and you'll be able to have dinner with your family as soon as 75% of Canadians have their first dose. And I think it's going to be very challenging for us to get to 75% of Canadians that are going to get vaccinated.
So it's interesting. I said on this pod, like maybe a year ago or not quite that long, or I said on Twitter, I can't remember where I said it, but I said this. I said that every day that vaccines were being administered in the United States and not in Canada was going to be a very bad day for the Trudeau government. That was true when that was the case for about 3 weeks or a month. It was bad. The government's ratings were declining. There was increasing criticism. Is Jenni right, Scott? Is this going to be a long summer for the government, for the federal government on vaccines?
No, I actually think that mood is shifting already. I think that they may, one dose summer is actually going to possibly become one of those rewarding things in a perverse way, in that I think that, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's an expectation that's going to get bettered. I think that people are seeing the availability of vaccines, like 4.5 million this week. And I know we wanted them in February, not now, but they're happening now. It's rolling. We're going to see that you're all going to get notices that second dose that was supposed to come now is going to be advanced. And I just think, I think that I think there's going to be a shift in people's attitudes towards that. And I think that political vulnerability is going to move pretty rapidly. I do think there are going to be really awkward and thorny questions. And here's a weird comparison in the United States where we're saying, oh, well, they all get to go to Predators games. But we're also going to find, Jenni says, what about 75%? It's a really important question. Like, what is our ceiling in terms of the number of people who are willing and able? Once you do what you need to do in order to penetrate hard to get to communities, and it's not a question of reluctant, it's not a question of availability, it's a question of reluctance. What's the ceiling? And the suggestion is that the ceiling of those willing to take the vaccine here in Canada is higher than it is in the United States. And we may find that we end up by the middle of the summer with a higher overall vaccination rate than the United States. And we're going to start to have like real ugly debates both inside the country and internationally as we say, okay, well, are we going to have vaccine passports or are we not? How do we open up the border if we feel that, there's too large percentage of Americans that say, sir, fuck it, I don't believe in vaccines. And, how do we deal with people that are reluctant here? Do their kids get to go to school? Do they not get to go to school? Do they get to come into the movie theater and sit next to me or the Raptors game? We're going to get those domestic and international passport questions, and those are really thorny, difficult public policy questions, and they will challenge governments, and they'll challenge them on the same sets of issues that lockdowns do, because there's an underlying cultural dimension to it around, wait a minute, do you or do you not have obligations to the community that trump your individual rights, or should your individual rights reign? And that's, I think we're in store for that argument domestically and in our relationship with the U.S.
Well, right now we're definitely not in the position of power, because they have 38% of Americans are fully vaccinated, 124 million people, and we have 4%. So I love the haughty Canadian attitude of looking down their nose at the United States. But the question right now is whether we'll open the border to them. It's whether they'll open the border to us.
Well, I don't think I was being haughty. I was talking about an issue that I think is coming.
Okay.
You guys are going to
fuck me, right? So who cares?
You guys are going to so disappoint the bistro today.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to say, I want to throw something out to the elders who listen to this podcast, which is that I think that 1 dose summer, 2 dose fall is the least inspiring slogan since 6 and 5, the anti-inflation program of the early 1980s. So we are actually, as it turns out, don't have time for Doug today. We got to go right to our Hey Yous. My Hey You goes out to Avi Lewis. Avi Lewis announced.
All right.
Avi Lewis announced that he's running for Parliament. And he's going to run in the riding of West Vancouver Sunshine Coast, which the NDP haven't for 20 years finished better than fourth in. I don't understand why he's doing this unless he doesn't want to win. So my conclusion some people might look at this and say, oh, the poor guy is so naive, he picked a bad riding. He's not naive. He comes from several generations of political leadership. He presumably has access to the most astute political advice possible. And that is a riding the NDP are going to win if they're forming the opposition in the country. Maybe if they're winning the government. They're not going to win it in a normal election. So I can only conclude that Avi Lewis does not want to be elected to be a member of Parliament. It's weird. You've had a lot to offer. That party's been asking you to run for a long time. Scott's been calling for you to run on this show, and you made the decision and you chose a riding that is almost certainly not going to take you to the House of Commons.
Yeah, the NDP got 15% there in the last election.
Yeah, they're the fourth party.
Well, I just think if he keeps following my advice, he's bound to have all kinds of future failures also. So keep on trucking, Avi. Well, my hey you goes to Sajjan, the Minister of Defense, who, as far as I can tell, has been absent without leave for quite a while on the files that he's managing, as we see one problem after another. But I'm not even going to talk about Denny Fortin and Vance and all of those other messes. Those have been well litigated and will continue to be litigated in the future. I'm just saying, Sajjan, like if you can't find it within yourself to pop up and do something on any of these other files, then do me this solid, would you? Come June 1st, when the Pentagon releases all of their UFO files, the UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenal files, tell us what we know, man. Do the same. Dish on the UFO. I'm sure they're up there hiding in the Northern Lights, buzzing around, monitoring our maple syrup. Tell us what you know, man. Tell us what you know. Match the Americans. Be transparent. Tell us what's really going on in the skies and above, because I want to believe.
Yeah, there's got to be an alien autopsy down in the Diefenbunker somewhere.
Precisely. They know it.
Yeah. Jenni, you got a hey you?
My hey you is I'm going back to Bill C10 and Stephen Guilbeault. It still remains as clear as mud in terms of what the government's position on this. It seems that they're continuing to let the narrative go that there will be CRTC control of or CRTC oversight of people's user-produced content on YouTube and Facebook, regardless of what the government is saying. Because if you look at the legislation, it basically what those parameters are to be determined by the CRTC at a later date. And so I think this is becoming an issue. I know that Mary Ying had a meeting with her counterpart where they talked about digital tax. There were those that said that it was around the auspices of Bill C10 as well as other things. So this is now actually causing concern for the government or for other governments in terms of dealing with other trade issues and what have you. So my hey you is to the Trudeau government, get your shit together regarding C10 and make it clear. And if Guilbeault can't do it, put him on the bench and communicate it yourself.
Jenni, don't you think that bill is aimed at us? Like, they want to shut us down, right? This is the anti-Herle Burly legislation. They need to regulate this thing and tell us what we can and can't say on here. I'm sure that's what it's about. Thank you all for another week. I want to thank Andre Picard for being our guest this week. So interesting. Thank you, Jenni. Thank you, Scott, for being here. I want to thank all of our listeners. I want to thank our sponsors. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS and CN Rail. And, of course, everybody for listening and watching. And go Habs, go. See you next week.
See you later.
See you later.